It's my pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Krista Stevens. Dr. Stevens is the Anisfield-Wolf Fellow in Diversity and Christian Social Teaching at John Carroll University. A former high school teacher, Dr. Stevens holds graduate degrees from Weston Jesuit School of Theology, where we were actually classmates.
Who knew we would run into each other today?
And then later Fordham University in the Bronx. Her research focuses on racial justice and Catholic social teaching, and she's here to speak to us this morning. So thank you and welcome.
Thank you. All right. So welcome, everyone. We're having, I wouldn't say technological difficulties, but just technological slowness, but hopefully this will work for us. As was said, I am Krista Stevens. I am actually very new to John Carroll and to Cleveland, so I'm really excited to kind of meet some of you all. And I ran into some old friends that I didn't know were in Cleveland, so that's always exciting. So we're talking about today the elective class, Living as a Disciple of Christ in Society. So here's my thoughts on this. They kind of advertise us as the experts, right? That's actually the word they use on the website. I don't actually know what that word means. I look around this room, and many of you have been teaching way longer than I have, so I think you all are the actual experts here. So hopefully together we can kind of come up with some best practices, some points of information to kind of highlight when we go into this class. I was a high school teacher. I did not like being a high school teacher. So I'm going to be very honest about that. So I have much respect for all of you who have been doing it for so many years. It was not for me. So I applaud all of you. And I'm, again, looking forward to hearing what you all have to say as well. Okay, so what I wanted to do first is kind of break down what this class means, right? What is the title of the class? So we have Living as Disciples of Jesus Christ. Okay, so what I like to do with my students, and I'm sure you all know this as well, is never assume that they know anything, right? So you can ask them, what does disciple mean? And they'll tell you, maybe they'll name some disciples or follower of Jesus and those kinds of things. And all those things are right, of course, right? But most of them are probably working from a very basic understanding of what disciple is. So I think what we first have to do is kind of help them unpack what discipleship actually means. So we have a basic definition, right? A follower of a teacher, an adherent to some sort of practice, right? So you can be a disciple of almost anyone or anything, okay? But we're talking about a very specific form of discipleship when we link it to Jesus Christ. So I think here's the first really important point that we have to help them make. How we understand discipleship has to be connected to how we understand Christ, and vice versa, right? How we understand Christ should influence or impact our understanding of discipleship. So this leads us to point 2. When we ask our students, who do you say Christ is? How many of you get something like this? Right?
Absolutely.
Yes. So how many of you have actually asked your students to kind of just to gauge their knowledge? How do they often define Christ or describe him to you all? Any sharers or funny stories? Yeah.
So I often ask, and this actually comes at the end of the year, which maybe is not helpful, but I've asked them kind of at the end of the year, like, who's Jesus to you? Mm-hmm. And most of them say, like, a friend. Many of them say a friend. Like, somebody who's looking out for me.
And that's not wrong, right? Nor is it a bad understanding of Christ, right? But I think, and for students this age, friendship is really important, often more important than kind of any other group connection that they're making. So, I don't want to take out this friendship definition, but what does it really mean to be a friend to someone, right? Think about your best friend. What would you do for them, okay? Good. Anyone else? I saw a couple hands, but anyone else? Yeah.
If they're Muslims, kids have said that they think he's not only a prophet, but second greatest prophet. And they bless, that Muslim students bless his name every time you mention him.
That's interesting.
Out loud.
How do your other students react to that?
Depending on the Muslim kid saying it, just like anything else. If it's the big football player, like star of the senior class, then probably with respect.
Sure.
Maybe with curiosity, because they might be learning that maybe they didn't know until that moment that Muslims know something or have a view on Jesus. Rarely with division or anything like
Sure.
that. Usually either with curiosity or with respect. something like that.
Good. And I think this is a good point, right? Because one of the really cool things I think about Catholic social teaching is that even if you're not Catholic or non-religious, right, no religion adherence whatsoever, there's lots of principles of Catholic social teaching that we can kind of pull in and embrace, and we could see cross connections with other religious ideals of justice and so forth. All right, so we have Christ. Christ maybe as a friend, but also maybe Christ is someone you just kind of hang out with on Sundays, maybe because your parents make you go, I don't know. But maybe someone you don't think about that often after that. All right, other ideas we might get: Christ as teacher, Christ as healer, preacher, miracle worker, all of those kinds of things, right? All good things. What I like to help students see is that Jesus is all of these things, but much more, right? Jesus is someone who flips the script, is a phrase I like to use. So I actually, because we're talking about pedagogy, here's something I like to do with my students. I'm going to actually ask for 2 volunteers. So can I have 2 volunteers? It won't be too embarrassing, probably. I don't know, maybe. No, probably not. Joe, thank you. And what's your name?
Aaron.
Aaron, all right. So I want, if Joe and Aaron could come up and face each other. By the way, Joe is one of my former classmates that I did not know I would meet today, so thank you, Joe. I'll try my best. Okay, so, all right, here's why I have Joe, and you're just going to stand here while I talk for a minute, so it might be a little bit embarrassing. But here's why I have them standing up here. Okay, so when we talk about who Jesus is, what does he teach, we get this idea of someone who teaches justice and nonviolence. And so when we deal with questions of Catholic social teaching, particularly around nonviolence, maybe we think Jesus just means passivity. We don't really need to stand up for things that we disagree with. We don't need to stand up towards people in power. We get passages like this. Hopefully I'm going to be able to skip ahead here. There we go. Okay, how many of you have used this passage in your class at some point in time? All right. How do your students often respond to this passage? What do they interpret Jesus as saying? Soft? What do you mean?
Sometimes the boys see it as he's not fighting.
Yeah, he's a coward, maybe. Good. Doormat, yeah.
Mine just really liked to hold on to, but he said eye for an eye.
Yeah.
I don't know.
So forget about the rest, but right? You heard it said.
Especially with the death penalty.
Yes, yes.
That's the thing they feel is you just, yeah.
Yes. Yeah, and so that also points to, I think, we all do this, right? But particularly young people kind of first experiencing Scripture, we have a really big tendency of kind of taking the parts that make sense to us and kind of forgetting about the rest. All right, so, but here's why I have Joe and Aaron up here. So Walter Wink, theologian, Protestant theologian, talks a lot about what he calls Jesus' third way and how Jesus kind of flips the script, so to speak. So here's how he interprets this passage. All right, so you two stand facing each other. Okay, all right, so when someone strikes you on your right cheek, all right, so Aaron, to strike Joe on his right cheek, well, see, your natural inclination is, are you right-handed? Yes. Yeah, so your natural inclination is to punch Joe, right, with the fist on the left cheek, right? But notice, that's not what Jesus is saying, right? He's saying when someone strikes you on your right cheek, so how would you have to hit Joe?
Well, I started to do this.
You would either have to back slap him or hit him with your left hand. Right, okay, very good. So here's what, don't go anywhere yet. Here's what Wink says. This is how Jesus is flipping the script. In Jesus' time, the left hand was used for unclean things. You would not use your left hand at all, except for unclean things, and you can imagine what those unclean things are. But there were penalties, right? If you did use your left hand for something else, there's penalties in the synagogue, in the temple, right? So you wouldn't do it. So you'd have to backhand him. Okay, so you can fake backhand him. Thank you. All right. What is a backhand usually used for? What does it usually insinuate?
Very denigrating.
Yeah, right? It's meant to humiliate, to denigrate. So if Erin backslaps Joe, she's showing Joe that he is an inferior of some sort, right? She has the power over him. So Wink is identifying these types of power structures where maybe a master or someone in power, a tax collector maybe, is striking a perceived inferior on the right cheek. So when Jesus says, turn the other cheek to him or her as well, so Joe, when you turn and give you your left cheek, now you have to hit him with your right hand, okay? Now, here's what Wink says. to punch with the right hand would be a sign of equality, right? You only fought someone in fistfights that you were on equal terms with, right? You're not going to get into a fist fight with a slave, right? That's beneath you. You wouldn't do that. So what Wink is saying here in this, and again, in his interpretation of this passage, is that Jesus is telling the person who is oppressed, the perceived inferior, well, just turn it back on them. You want to backslap me? Fine. Hit me on the other side and make me your equal, okay? So not backing down here. Joe might get into more trouble. Aaron's probably not going to punch him, but maybe Joe gets flogged or, I don't know, whatever masters did to slaves at the time. So it's not backing down. It's not passivity. It's not even kind of shunning off more punishment, but it's telling the person, we're equals. If you're going to have power over me, we're going to do this on my terms and my terms only. All right? So Joe is pushing back against Aaron's power. All right. You two can sit down. Thank you very much. Hope that wasn't too embarrassing. Yeah, thank you very much. So in the rest of this passage, if you remember, the rest of it talks about giving a person your cloak, right? We didn't want to get anyone naked here. That would be weird. Walking the extra mile with soldiers. And so Wink talks more into how these things kind of flip the script as well. And if you're interested in that, I can kind of point you to his article on that. But his point in these passages that are often seen as passivity is that Jesus is actually pushing back in really kind of subtle ways, right? So what does that mean for us in our understanding of Jesus? So we go back to our question, of course, of who is Jesus? Hopefully. So how's everyone doing? Any questions while I wait for this to catch up? Yeah.
Would you say in a sense that Christ is trying to open their eyes to their own evil?
Open their eye, who's?
The person who is offending him.
Oh, yeah.
Like he's really basically trying to open their eyes to their own evil.
Absolutely, right? And that's what Wing talks about with Jesus kind of flipping the script. He's flipping the terms of the arrangement. And so Joe was saying to Aaron, you're doing something wrong, and if you want to continue to do that, we're going to do it as equals, right? So you've already made a first misstep by treating me as an inferior, by not treating me as a human, right, made in God's image. Okay, well, hopefully this will work. If not, I needed a breath anyway, so. Oh, there we go. Oh, way too far. Okay. Nope. It's going to do all the functions I made. Okay. All right. So continuing with Jesus. This is not what I wanted. Go back again. Go back again. There we go. All right. So we have Jesus as someone who flips the script, who pushes boundaries, who's not advocating for passivity in any way, shape, or form, but kind of pushing back against power. So how do we connect this to discipleship? Well, we see in the scriptures, in the Gospels, that this idea of discipleship is very active, right? So discipleship isn't just about going to church on Sundays. That's certainly part of it. But when we look in the scripture, Jesus is actually calling his disciples and saying, go out and do something, right? So in the Synoptic Gospels, Jesus calls his disciples. This is the common passage where he names them and he kind of lists the 12 and then lists Judas who will betray him. So the basic calling. And then we have the Great Commissioning at the end of Matthew where Jesus says, and I have it in bold here, go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, Son, Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all that I have commanded you. So discipleship is active. When we talk about living as disciples in Christ, we're talking not just about believing in Jesus or following the church's rules or following, believing what Jesus teaches, but actually going out and doing something with our beliefs, right? So how do we take those those ideas out into our world? And this, of course, brings us back to this question of society. And I think one of the things we really need to help our students do is kind of broaden their understanding of society, their role in society, and how it's important to them, right? So we want them to think, obviously, about their local communities, their families, their schools, their sports teams, their extracurricular activities, but also their local communities. Where in Cleveland do they live? Where are their schools located, right? What's going on in Cleveland at large? What's going on in greater Ohio, the United States, so forth and so on, right? So really broadening their understanding of society. Okay, any questions or anything so far? Yeah, Joe.
Quick question about, how public Christ might be calling them, not just for discipleship, but for ritual, for sacraments. It seems to me like this wouldn't have been done in a room with no one else around monthly. That discipleship is meant to be public, like the telling of it is meant to be public. So too is the ritual and sacramental nature of our community. So maybe you're going to get to that, but I wonder what you think about it. Because he does call people to pray in private too.
Sure.
But then it seems like discipleship seems to be something a little different.
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't think that they're in any way not connected, right? And so when we go through some of the key themes of Catholic social teaching in a second, we'll see kind of this balance of adherence to Scripture and personal reflection and prayer, and then what that leads us to do, right? Because, right before in the last slide, particularly in the Synoptics, where Jesus is, in at least one of the stories, he has gone up to the mountain by himself to kind of pray and think things through, and then he comes down and calls his disciples, right? So there's a close connection there, I think, of kind of the individual that must also be public, right? So again, for me, that's the idea of Jesus and kind of social thought being not just going to church on Sundays, which is itself a public event, right? But for many people, it's a very personal thing. You do, and then maybe you don't think about church, right, the rest of the week. So how do we help them see that discipleship is more than just this hour or two on Sunday and something much more public, right, as you said? Good question, and if it comes up again or if I don't fully address it, certainly let me know. I raise the question again. Anyone else? Okay, so hopefully this will work this time. Jesus is third way. Okay. So the course itself, this is directly taken from the doctrinal elements of a curriculum framework. So you're probably familiar with this, but just in case you're not, the purpose of the course is to do several things. Introduce students to the church's social teaching. In this course, students are to learn how Christ's concern for others, especially the poor and needy, is present today in the church's social teaching and mission. So this course, again, is very much focused on the outward life of the disciple out in the world, especially from the poor and the needy. All right. Again, from the doctrinal framework. I'm not going to read through all of these just because it would take a lot of time, but in the doctrinal framework itself, it actually lists these kind of 5 emphases on how to set up the class and kind of things that you'll go through. But the main takeaway is God's plan for God's people. Again, I'm not going to read the whole thing, but this idea first and foremost that the church itself is a sign of Christ and of the church's social teaching, right? So it's within the church that we learn these things. The church itself as the mystical body of Christ. So the church should, in the ideal, right, give us our first kind of example of what good society should look like, should serve as a model for how we bring that out into the world. So that's point 1. Point 2, the social teaching of the church. So this interesting balance, I think, between charity and justice, a good discussion, I think, to have with your students. This one's also focused on kind of the more philosophical, different types of justice, so utilitarianism, commutative justice, restorative justice, those kinds of things. Social teachings in the modern era, right? Catholic social thought is a largely modern thing, not that social thought hasn't always existed, but in this form that we currently know it, really since the 1900s or so. Number 3, this is what we're going to focus most on, major themes of Catholic social teaching, so we'll come back to this. Number 4, I think an important focus here, and also an important thing to help our students kind of come to grapple with, this idea that sin isn't just personal, right? I think a lot of us growing up, from our parents and from our church and pastors and so forth, are taught, we're supposed to be good. We do these things and we don't sin. We avoid these things and we don't sin. And that's fine. But sin is also social, right? There can be sins that a community participates in. This one's also focused on some of the scriptural foundations of Catholic social teaching. So the 2 great commandments, love God, love your neighbor. The 10 commandments themselves as social. And then challenges. This is my favorite part, because I'm sure it's something that you all have experienced working with young people. But why shouldn't we consider ourselves first? Young people are great, right? But we all know they can also be very self-focused, okay? Just the stage of their life, right? So how do we help them see beyond themselves, okay? Why is that important? Isn't human success measured in terms of money? So think about all the things they're seeing on TV, on social media, and music, this kind of glorification of materials. Well, that goes against a lot of what Catholic social teaching says. So how do we help them reshape their understanding of those things? We already touched on the doesn't not fighting back equal weakness with the Walter Wink thing. And then this idea of charity and justice. All right, so here's what I want to do. All right, let's talk about Catholic social teaching. I was looking for, I couldn't decide on which one I liked, right? So I went with all of them. Yeah, right. But this is playing on, I think, a common trope that's not untrue, of course, that Catholic social teaching is the church's best kept secret. So something that not a lot of people know about, are familiar with, any of those kinds of things. So I've polled my students, right, and mostly college students, and I've asked them, have you ever heard of Catholic social teaching? And in each class, 2 or 3 tops generally raise their hand. And these students generally have come from Catholic high schools, so you guys are doing your job, which I appreciate. But I would imagine when you get them in your classes, most of them have not heard of Catholic social teaching before stepping into your class. So how do we make this more well known? All right, Catholic social teaching, you have the principles here on the right. We're going to go through them as time allows, kind of one by one. But I also want to point out this quote on the left from Thomas Massaro. He has this really great book, Living Justice, Catholic Social Teaching in Action. It's actually geared toward a younger audience, so it might be a good resource for you all if you're looking for something to kind of help supplement the bishop's curriculum. But he specifically wrote this for high school and younger college age students. So it has all of the details in depth about Catholic social teaching, but less of the heady kind of framework stuff that our kids might get lost in. But here's what he writes, and I think this is really important, again, especially for young people at this stage in their lives, as we talked about earlier, who often see things in very black and white ways. All right, there is much firmness and substance in the content of Catholic social thought. So there are some universal truths. But, this is the key point, this body of teaching exhibits great sensitivity to the shades of gray in our complex world and to the ways that even the universal principles require careful and sensitive application to specific circumstances in various places. Tracy talked a little bit about this in her keynote address, right? The young woman that she was referencing who went to college and was not able to kind of fit into her kind of conservationist lifestyle. Well, how do we what's the gray area there? What do we do? What do we not do? So really helping our students kind of step out of their black and white mentalities and see that not everything has a simple answer. That's hard for all of us to do, I think, but I think something that's very important. Okay, before I go on any further, because I know I'm moving a little fast here, any questions or comments? Anything that needs clarification? All right. So let's move through the principles here. The way I have this set up is just the basics of the principle. I would imagine most of you are at least somewhat familiar with these. And then on the next slide, we'll talk more about what we do in class with these themes, right? So more of the pedagogical stuff, and then we can have, I think, more of a back and forth there. All right. First principle, life and dignity of the human person. This is the foundational core key principle of Catholic social teaching, right? This makes sense. Everything else builds off of this, grounded in the very opening of Scripture. God says, let us make human beings in our image, after our likeness. God created humankind in God's image. In the image of God, God created them, male and female, God created them. Let's push our students here. What does it mean to say that they're created in God's image and likeness? One of our colleagues raised a question in the keynote address about kids' feeling of self-worth and self-value, something young people struggle with. We all struggle with it, right? But think back to when you were a teenager. That's a big struggle, okay? What this tells us is that all of us are created by God. All of us are good. No matter what we think about ourselves, all of us are good. All of us are loved by God. And all of us deserve respect, right? So I think this is the good first principle to start with to really help students start seeing the value of themselves and other people. So how do we bring this into class? So some questions we might ask them. And some of these questions might be hard to ask, right? You know your students better than I do, of course. You know the situations they live in. You might know something about their family life or their community life, right? Some things that are very challenging to them, depending on where you work. But we start with this idea of each person possessing a basic dignity, and then we go from there, right? Ask your students, where do you see human dignity compromised? I would imagine they all know how to respond to that question, okay? Maybe in their own lives, maybe something they've seen on TV or in the news, in their communities, in the world at large. We shouldn't shy away, I don't think, from asking them these tough questions to identify places in their world where people are suffering. Now again, you know your students better than I do and what's good to ask them and what's not, but I do think the importance of the challenge is there. Ask them to think more broadly about the institutions they belong to, their schools, their churches if they go to church, the government, the economy, criminal justice system. Do these things protect and promote dignity? What is their understanding of these things? Right to life issues, right? More than just abortion. Not that that's wrong in any way. It's an important part of this. But can we broaden their understanding of what it means to be pro-life? Things like euthanasia, capital punishment, consumerism, right? How does materialism affect our understanding of others? Racism, war, immigration, all of these things that are part of this whole life movement that we don't often talk about. They're probably aware of these things, right? They're on social media, they're seeing YouTube videos, they're seeing posts on Facebook and Twitter and I don't know, stuff that they use that I've never heard of, right? I'm sure. But they're familiar with some of these things, okay? They know that something is going on in the world. Okay, so I have some sources up here, and then I want to hear from you all as well. Anything you might add or any concerns you might have. How can we apply this, right, in the classroom? Some interactive things. How many of you are podcast listeners? Okay, good. How many of you have ever listened to the Serial podcast? Excellent. Who has listened to season 3? Good. I saw some kind of. I haven't finished it either. I'm not even caught up. But what's going on in season 3 of Serial? Can anyone want to tell us? What's the focus? Yeah.
So she wanted to go, rather than looking at one like outstanding case, she wanted to look at a bunch of smaller cases. Cleveland was one of the only justice systems and courthouses that gave her unlimited access to recording everything and everywhere, which is curious but interesting. And so she's looking at different cases and how they're handled within the city of Cleveland. And it's hard. It's hard to listen to.
Would you mind saying more? Yeah, would you mind saying more about why it's hard?
Yeah, so I teach, I'm at St. Martin de Porres, so I'm right downtown. Most of my kids live in the city of Cleveland, and most of my students are students of color. And they're just the way that people in the justice system talk about offenders, talk about people of color, talk about people who are poor, the way that the justice system is set up in a way that doesn't support people who are, like, you need to know a lot in order to walk out of there and be successful. It's been really hard to listen to, but I also think is like deeply important.
Good. Thank you. Right.
It's really close to home because it is our city.
Yeah, exactly, right? So this is, I think, a good tool to use. Now, of course, you would want to listen to these episodes first before you kind of bring them to your kids to kind of figure out what you might want to leave out and what you might want to focus on. But something you can do in class with them, you can listen together, something you can ask them to do at home. If they have any sort of internet connectivity, these podcasts are free, so they can easily listen to them with no out-of-pocket expense for them. And it hits close to home, right? It's something that they can kind of, it's kind of something, what's the word I'm looking for? That they can touch, right? That they can kind of wrap their minds around. Excellent. Some other just kind of book sources. Michelle Alexander has a really great book called The New Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration in the Age of Colorblindness. Talks about the disproportionate number of people of color, and specifically men of color, in jail. The bishops talk about this as well, right? So if you want to back up the bishop's curriculum with more stuff from the bishops, right? Or if you really are trying to stick to Catholic-specific documents, the USCCB, Responsibility, Rehabilitation, and Restoration, a Catholic perspective, also talking about criminal justice stuff. You can find both of these on the USCCB website. They also have one that they wrote in with the Mexican Catholic bishops on immigration, called Strangers No Longer, Together on a Journey of Hope. So these documents can be fairly long, so you probably want to use pieces of them, most likely. But a way to give them kind of real-life examples of where human dignity might be damaged or not respected. And then case studies. Tracy talked about this. I love case studies. I think they're a really good way to help students think through an actual problem. There's a book I use a lot called Christian Ethics, a Case Method Approach. The case study that I would recommend from that one is called A Life for a Life. It's looking at the death penalty and someone's kind of struggle with whether or not that's a just punishment. All right, I want to hear from you all, if you would like to share any thoughts or any suggestions you might have on addressing this principle, any questions you might have. Yes, ma'am.
I'm sure that for all of us who teach social justice, especially in the current political climate, it is a challenge because when you're teaching church teaching on social justice, and we'll just use life and dignity of the human person, you end up teaching the church's position, and yet you have expressions both from students and from parents. Well, wait a minute, are you going to one side or the other politically? But if they understood what the church teaches,
Yes.
it's about life and dignity of the human person. And so, I had a father at Meet the Teacher nights a few weeks ago express some concern to me about the topics I had posted. He said, well, that's awfully political. That's church teaching.
Yeah.
So, welcome any thoughts or comments about how to navigate that water.
I can respond, but I think I'm in a little bit different position as a college professor. I don't have quite the same authority looking over my shoulder, so to speak. So I would rather hear from someone else. Go ahead.
Well, I live in a very small community in Ohio, and there's definitely a climate there. And what I found, my seniors are doing a research project, and they are digging into the social justice, and they're reading it for themselves and finding it on their own. So it's not, again, me stuffing it down their throats or whatever they want. They love to say stuff like that, like cram Catholicism down your throat. But in this case, I was hesitant to do it because it seems like it's so vast. But they are finding on their own these documents, these different resources. So then it's not accusatory. I mean, it's on the USCCB.
Well, and I think that's why I wanted to include some of these, right? So everything that we're going to talk about, the bishops, almost everything, have written something specifically on that topic. This is what the church teaches. And it may seem to fall on a political side, but that, of course, is not what they're doing. Yeah.
Right. I think that's the way that we can get into that. If you go to the USCCB's website, if you go to the social thought section, it lists
Tons.
So many.
Yeah.
issues
That's what I mean.
and direct statements from the USCCB on those issues. And so if we can have our students start with that and then broaden to supporting website. You can't get more authoritative than that in the American Church.
All right, so 2 more hands. Adam had a hand, and then you, sir, over here.
Yeah, I would just say also the way that the department, the other theology teachers work together. So, for example, I don't teach social justice, but I teach the course on the Bible, and the bishops do a great job on the website of connecting the CST with the prophets. So when I teach the prophets, I kind of till the soil, and I don't go into Catholic social teaching, but I do my best to kind of make it easier for the other teachers in my department to kind of point things out, and as freshmen kind of give them little snippets of it so that it's not so much of a secret or like an earth-shattering thing later on. Collaboration is really key, particularly when different courses kind of touch on that sort of stuff.
Good, thank you. Go ahead.
I'm glad to hear Laura say that because last year was brutal. And I did have people come to me and say this is too political. But then at the end of the year, one of my students said, your class is so frustrating because you never told us what you thought. You're constantly telling us what Jesus taught or what the church teaches. And that was reassuring at least. But the thing that struck me about this, and this is a focus of mine, the kids, if they're upperclassmen and they're taking government, and some of those kids have very strong political views, is I make sure that in the context of this discussion, we look at founding documents like, do we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are made, created, endowed by their creator? And so I have a little trick question I like to ask them, and I asked them if they knew that, if they could explain why Abraham Lincoln's wife didn't vote for him, and the answer that they give is that she was a Democrat. And I'm like, no, it's not why she didn't vote for him. And they don't, so I try to include, in addition to talking about these things, how are they true of this society? And if you're a patriot, if you're an American, and you think that human beings have a right, by virtue of the fact that they're endowed by their creator with these rights and that kind of thing. And so I try to do some cross-curricular stuff that looks at founding documents and the ways that these kinds of things are also true if you're an American. And I include looking at those kinds of documents. But one other thing I would say in terms of your list there is Brian Stevenson and his TED Talk on injustice and what does injustice and justice have to do with our identity, not just personally but as a nation. And that ties back into that government lesson. So who do we say that we are? How does that affect what we do? And how does what we do change the story we tell ourselves about who we are? And that way it's not just the Catholic perspective, but if we're going to be Americans, like forming consciences for faithful citizenship, what does this do to your citizenship, to your faith? How do those things come together? So I'm glad to hear you say it because I feel last year was brutal, but it's reassuring to know that maybe we're all in that boat.
I need that name.
Yeah, what's the TED Talk's name, or the guy's
Brian
name?
Stevenson. He represents, he's a lawyer who represents kids who are on death row in the South. His TED Talk is brilliant. It's called We Need to Talk About an Injustice. It's only 18 minutes long, maybe. He's also profiled in the film Human, if you use that, and that's powerful. It's a French film, Human, that's just first-person narrative of people's experiences of life from around the world, and it's astonishing. And he's in that film as well.
He wrote Just Mercy.
Okay.
Is his book, and he works for the Southern, or the, Southern Poverty Law Center.
And just out of curiosity, why did Mrs. Lincoln not vote for?
Yeah.
You left us all hanging.
Because women couldn't vote.
Oh. See, that's good.
Right? Like, oh, wait a minute. You mean Abraham Lincoln? He was president and he didn't let his own wife vote? Right? Yeah. So there's like the country we'd ideally like to be, identity, and the country that we are. And so are the founding fathers saying some things that are bigger than their own understanding? And if that's true of America, how is that true of the church? How is that true of our, there's the things we teach, we idealize, and then the things we do. And we're a pilgrim people. We're trying to get there. We're not there yet.
That's good. I feel a little silly now, but thank you.
Okay, yeah. Welcome to class. That's how they do it.
All right, good. Thank you all very much. So just for the sake of time, let's move on to the next one. This one's a good one, right? Call to family, community, and the common good. You might see this phrase a little differently depending on, what kind of handout you're looking at. But key takeaways from this are dignity, this thing that we've been talking about, right? That's grounded in our createdness by God, is intimately tied up with others, right? So this idea of humans as inherently relational and social, right? So it's not just about us. We're inherently social. So again, ask them to think about the social groups they're a part of, sports teams, choir, drama club, whatever it is that they do, right? These are social, they do these things hopefully because they like them, right? They like doing things with other people. Crucial importance of the family. This one might get hard, particularly if you're working with students who are experiencing some sort of brokenness in their family. So how do we navigate those kind of things as well? But again, the church does heavily emphasize the importance of family. This idea that we are one body, when one suffers, we all suffer, right? A key concept. We'll get back to that in just a second. And then our participation in building up a society is both a right and an obligation. This goes to the idea of all of us being kind of social and having each other's backs, so to speak. So what happens when we take this into the classroom? Again, there are some good local examples to help them look at. Asking them again to think about their social groups. Why are these social groups important to them? Why do they make them feel good? How do they broaden their understanding of the groups that they're actually a part of beyond just the immediate? Really asking them to think about, well, when we say we are one body, when one suffers, everyone suffers, what does that mean? So I often ask my students, who plays sports? And almost always you have an athlete in your class. Say they're on the basketball team. All right, well, who's the star on the basketball team? And they'll say, John Smith. It's a star person on the basketball team. All right, well, think about it. You're in the playoffs. John Smith has sprained his knee and cannot play. Does your team play as well? No, probably not, right? So a very simple example of what it means when we say if one person suffers, we all suffer. Now, of course, that's a very basic example, right? Again, something they can wrap their minds around. If they take out their star athlete, the team suffers. Or if we take out the soloist from the choir suffers. The key, again, is always thinking more broadly beyond their immediate social relations. But as far as sources, as you can see, I love podcasts. I use them quite a bit in my own classes. There's a This American Life podcast called The Problem We All Live With. It talks about education and segregation and how that affects community and community cohesiveness. More locally, we have something called, you may all be familiar with this, if I can get the cursor to work here. All right, A Greater Cleveland. Anyone heard of this from the local newspaper? Yeah, what's it doing? What's the point of this? We're going to watch it anyway, but what's the point of this?
Hope there's no shooting. When I'm sleeping, if I hear shooting, I'm going to get under my bed.
Just outside the downtown you know is the Cleveland you probably don't. In these neighborhoods, most children are being raised by single moms. Every day brings a struggle to make ends meet, to stay safe, to nurture hope. Cleveland.com's new project, A Greater Cleveland, aims to get those of us living well outside poverty's grip to think differently about the people who live in public housing and in the poorest zip codes. In this ongoing series, you will step inside the lives of children growing up in the inner city. You will get to know their sweet idiosyncrasies and hear all about their dreams. But you will also see the daily challenges they face, the harmful influences, the violence, the lack of opportunities. These are the roadblocks that stand between them and a prosperous future. Through each story, we hope to bring people closer together, to break the cycle of generational poverty, to give our kids a fighting chance at the future they deserve, and to build Greater Cleveland.
So if you're unfamiliar with this, if you just Google A Greater Cleveland or go on to cleveland.com, you should be able to find it. But they've done a recent kind of local series of stories on poverty in Cleveland, primarily East Cleveland and some of those neighborhoods. And if you go on the website, they actually follow several families, kind of their day-to-day life, how things like poverty and violence and poor educational resources and lack of health care, how that really undercuts their community's ability to thrive and to flourish. So again, something close to home. You may have students who live in these neighborhoods, right? So of course, gauge, your comfortableness with bringing this up. If you're teaching students who come from primarily privileged backgrounds, this might still be important, or it is important, right, to show them that in very close proximity to where many of them live are people living radically different lives, right? So how should they respond to that? Questions, comments, pedagogical techniques? Yeah.
This is a relatively new course for me this year. It's my first semester of doing it. And I'm interested to hear the experiences of this room in engaging students in discussion. At the 12th grade level, I've had some days in these first 7 weeks that have been home runs, but I feel like we've got really far. And probably more days that feel like I'm going to get attacked with pitchforks and torches and things like that. So just, we've done different ways where I've had kids in fishbowls up front. I've tried, passing an object for that person being able to speak, and then limiting it to one person answers a question and one person can respond. So I just interested to hear how, what sort of structures are in place in these classroom discussions that other people might have.
I found that similar to the fishbowl, like structured debate settings, that you give them the parameters so that they can, you go through the content, you give them multiple sides, you give them the church's side, form teams, and let them role play on a case. And if you can make it a real case, like a local case, that's even better, I think. But you're right, it's hard and it's complicated. It's a touch of it. But I found that to be successful if I can get out of the way a little bit and let them work on teams to discuss, debate, with the hope that the courtroom comes to the same conclusion that the church does. But they know the church's stance, even if the courtroom decides something different. But just giving them that place to talk. That's what I'm doing.
I would say to really openly your own humility in class and be open to them, and then they will start opening up to you. This is my first year too, and I've had them get to know me on a more human level, and my own humility and the things in my own life that help me come to my decisions, because I'm going to be 50 and I've had enough experience in my life that I need to draw out some humility there of things in my own life, which I notice now, after a few months of working here and with them, they're starting to open up more to me about, and not be afraid to give their input about stuff.
I've also had a lot of luck sorting. When I sort my class into groups, and I use that a lot because it's a lot more vacuum to have them talk to each other. Sometimes aside, I'm like usually very in trouble with everyone. We kind of group think of everyone agreeing what you don't like, even assigning like different parts of the group to kind of debate each other a little bit. From there, then it gives me a lot of options, because then I can call on anyone in the class, people that don't talk as much, and they should have something to say about what they contributed. But again, it's a way of not being, as much in the center, because that is a problem with that, right? Is it being all directed to you as opposed to getting a better sense of diversity of opinions in the class.
Ask them at the end what they thought really went well. Survey them before the end. Try different activities to what we call making thinking visible. So instead of having a discussion, have people get on their feet and divide the room into this polarity and that polarity, and ask them to vote with their feet and watch as the issues change. They find themselves on the same side of the room as one kid, but then on the other side of the room, and then ask them, why are you where you are? And why did you move from that side of the room to the other side? What do you think of the people on that side of the room? And find new ways to get them to verbalize or to make material their abstract thoughts, and to do that, but also then potentially go back to the stages thing, maybe to hear what another person is saying, and mix it up, get them on their seats. There's lots of little activities you can do to make it visible.
I think one of the big strengths, one of the challenges with this class is a lot of folks come in thinking this is an opinion-based class. And this is, you need to understand and be able to articulate Catholic social teaching. If you agree with it, if you disagree with it, that's a different thing. But at that foundational level, do you have that knowledge and understanding? And to kind of put it on that. There were a lot of, particularly at the beginning of the year when I taught the course, There are a lot of guys who want to get into opinion debates, and it sounds kind of harsh, but it's like, I don't care what you think. You need to understand Catholic social teaching, and then we can build on that and evaluate our understandings and our opinions based on that. But we have to have that common language at that start.
I just do one more real quick.
Yeah, just so connected to that, whenever we do in-class conversations or seminars, I started with just like having kids talk, and that just turned into like yelling at each other and our opinions. And so now which was great, but not what we were talking about in the course. Entertaining sometimes, also sometimes frightening. So I give them like very specific questions that are open-ended and connect to material, but like direct them in the direction that I want them to go. And they have to complete those before they come in. So they have to do writing, they have to think about it before they come in for the conversation. And I found that has led to more productive conversations, more conversations about like how it connects to Catholic social teaching versus just like, this is my opinion, everyone else is wrong, and I just want to yell about it.
Good.
Because kids just like to yell at each other.
Yeah, and
like in a productive way, but they don't listen very well.
Right, no, right. But no, this is a good question too, because I think what you're saying it kind of leads into this third one here about rights and responsibilities. Again, things that are often highly politicized,
yes,
and things that our students often may have very strong opinions about. So when the church teaches about fundamental rights, I mean, most of us grew up right to food, shelter, and housing. All right, we can all kind of wrap our minds, we'll agree with that, right? Everyone should have food, shelter, housing. Well, what happens when we talk about things like a right to education? What does that mean? A right to health care, who pays for it? A right to employment, what should you be paid? These are all things that I would imagine you'll find disagreements with among your students as to A, whether these are even rights to begin with, and if they are rights, how do we handle them? But again, right, we're backing this up with, well, this is what the church says. These are rights. You go back to the USCCB page again, and they'll identify all of these things as rights, right? Healthcare, education, employment. Right to participate in decisions affecting our lives. So helping our students realize, again, their own importance in shaping not just their lives, but the communities around them, right? The young men and women kind of growing into themselves, soon hopefully to go to college or into the workforce, who will have great responsibilities in how things work in the future. So we've talked a little bit about this already. Now again, this is a difficult one to kind of go through in class, but the bishops give us a document on this idea of rights and responsibilities, particularly when it comes to voting. So have them look at faithful citizenship, right? Why it's important that Catholics are really, as the bishops say, all people of goodwill, so anyone. Why it's important that we form and shape our consciences in how we decide to vote. Now, here's where things get complicated, but I also think interesting, but where you might also have students kind of screaming into the abyss at each other and not really listening. But look at parts of what faithful citizenship says. Explore the church's teaching in light of politics, right? If you haven't read this document, look through it. The church is very clear about what things they hold to be important in making political decisions. Have your students set up these kind of debates that you were talking about, right? What do we do when we disagree with the church's teachings? And then this question of, is there a perfect candidate who fits within all of the church's teachings? Of course not, right? So then what do we do? So help them walk through that kind of gray area that Massaro was talking about a little while ago. Those of you working with seniors are soon to be of voting age if they are not already. This is something really, I think, interesting to do with them, given that they will hopefully be voting very soon. How do they shape their own thoughts and minds when it comes to making these decisions? And again, what do they do when no candidate fits perfectly within the church's teaching? How do they navigate those gray areas? For the sake of time, because I think we've touched on this a little bit already, I'm going to move on to this one. So I want to make sure we definitely get to this one before our time runs out. This one is also, I think, one of the ones I found most difficult to kind of get across in class. Option for the poor and the vulnerable. in my opinion, I think this is probably one of the other kind of most important theme, along with the very first one of human dignity. What I think we can help them understand, there are many different types of poverty. So when we think of poverty, we generally think of economic poverty, right? Not having enough money to meet our basic needs. But challenge them to think about ways that people can be poor beyond economics. So cultural poverty, transportational poverty, right? What happens if you can't afford a car? Well, how does that affect how you get to school or how you get to work, for example? What if you don't have access to museums or can afford to go to museums or to sporting events or to the theater? Are you missing something good and valuable in life if you don't have access to those things, or to libraries or to computers or internet, all of those things? So many different types of poverty. And then again, where we often get into some conflicting ideas here, we are called to look at public policy decisions based on the way they affect the poor and vulnerable. Now again, this gets controversial, but it is what the church says. Public policy should be evaluated based on how it treats those among us who are marginalized and oppressed. So, what does it mean to say that God prefers the poor? Does God really prefer the poor? Does God not like me? Of course not. So here's an example, because I say this to students and they're like, nah, that doesn't make any sense to me, right? God can't prefer the poor. Here's how I try to help them wrap their minds around it, and I'll ask it to you all. How many of you have a sibling, a brother or sister? Okay, so almost all of you. Think back to when you and your siblings were children, and your sibling was sick or maybe injured, right? Maybe broke his or her arm or something like that. In those moments of their infirmity, who got more of your parents' attention, you or the sibling? Anyone, just say it out loud. Sibling. The sibling, good. Now, does that mean your parent loved the sibling more? Now, maybe, right? We all know parents have favorites, okay? But probably not, right? If you all are parents, I'm sure you have favorite kids, though you might not admit it. But that's what we're talking about here, right? It's not that your brother and sister who had the flu was better than you, right? Or more important than you. But in that time period, they needed special care, right? They needed more of mom and dad's attention to get better. And so that's what we're talking about here when we talk about preferential option for the poor. We want to be very careful here. We're not saying poverty is a good thing, right? There's not something valuable and special about being poor, right? We don't want to idolize the poor or make that something that's good to be. That's not what we're saying here, right? But that those who are poor and marginalized deserve special concerted attention from those of us who are not oppressed, to kind of walk with them and help them get better as your parents did with your brother and sister. Now again, we see this in Scripture, right? Matthew 25. Students like to quote this one a lot, I've found. I was hungry and you gave me food, thirsty you gave me drink. You're all very familiar with this. Except, ask our students, when do we as a society fail to live up to this principle? Now again, you might be accused of being political here, but these are still fundamental issues of justice. Well, okay, we're supposed to feed people who are hungry, but what happens when a public policy cuts food stamps or health care, or when drinking water is polluted, right? Those are issues of justice. How do we address policies that affect those things? Incarceration of people of color, deportation of immigrants, right? Again, controversial things, but important things to talk about. For sources, another case study, homelessness, the how and why of caring. Who cares about Haiti anyway? I do want to open this one because I think it's kind of interesting. And you can either do this, I think, in class together or have your students do it at home to kind of come back to talk about it. Hopefully this will open. Anyone ever done this before? Yeah, what was your experience with it? Did you do it yourself or with students?
No, I actually did it with youth group when we
Okay.
did something. We had a cardio camp out and some of the things we do. And they try to beat the system, so they try to look for the right answer.
And how, are they successful?
Sometimes they are. They figured out there is a way to do it.
Yes. But they still had to be crafty, right, to beat the system. Yeah. So this is what placement does, and we'll just go through a couple here. It's forcing us or asking us, I guess, to look at poverty. So I think our students have this sense of, well, I will have enough money to do the things that I want if I get a good job and go to college and so forth. I asked my college students recently, they're 20, 21, how many of them expected to own a house within 5 years, and like 95% of them raised their hands, and I did try not to laugh at them. But I feel like a lot of our students don't have a good sense of what cost of living actually is. So we won't go through all of this because it'll take a bit, but it asks you to make certain choices. All right, so you want a job. Do you want to work for $9 an hour on the second shift? Do you want to, hopefully this will open.
Could you say the name of it again?
Play Spent, play and then spent, SPENT.org. There we go. Do you want to work at a restaurant for $2.13 an hour plus tips, or do you want to be an office temp? What do we want to do? Office temp. All right. So we are going to be an office temp. All right. Your weekly pay, right? Your monthly pay before taxes. Not a lot of money, right? As I'm sure you all know. They take out taxes. I think a lot of our students are surprised when they get their first paychecks that half of it is gone. Hard lesson to learn. Okay, so you're left with this amount of money, and then you can go through, and it gives you various situations, right? So you have to have insurance, part of the Affordable Care Act. So let's say we choose the cheapest one, okay? Well, it's still taking out a significant portion of our money. We've now lost 25% of our take-home pay. And then you just keep going through this, all right? So you got to find a place to live. Well, where can you live for $808? Can you live close to where you're working, or do you have to live far away? If you live far away, how much do you pay for gas, so forth and so on. We'll do one more. So let's say you're paying $800 a month for your apartment. You're paying, this is an interesting statistic here. Every dollar you save on housing, you pay 77 cents on the dollar for gas or transportation. So you can see, right, they get a visual of where their money goes and how little they have left, right? So it really gets them thinking about things like fair wages. So the highest hourly wage that was given here was $9 an hour, which I think is above Cleveland. I don't know what Cleveland's minimum wage is. Anyone know? $8.30, okay. So a little above Cleveland's minimum wage, but really something that's not a living wage, right? So asking them to think about things about like a living wage versus a fair wage, right? What does that actually mean? Questions or comments on this one?
Opportunity Atlas, you guys use that too?
I don't know what that is. What is it?
It's a new tool. It's an Atlas tool that allows you to play with incarceration rates, poverty rates, single parent homes.
Oh, nice.
You can just basically change the parameters and they'll show you this country. And it's astonishing. It is unbelievable. It's put together with census data and other data. Opportunity Atlas. It's an astonishing.
Does it allow you to like hone in on one specific city?
You can zoom in and in Bay Village, there's a bad side and a good side, and you can see wealth reflected, income, the cost of houses. You can zoom in your own neighborhood and find out if there's a bad neighborhood in your suburb. It's unbelievable. Check it out. It's brand new, and it's pretty amazing.
Yeah. Anyone else? Because I want to build on what you just said. So I want to introduce you guys to another thing that you might be familiar with. Go ahead.
So I was just going to say, my greatest success for talking about preferential option for the poor is we talk about Black Lives Matter versus All Lives Matter, and my students are primarily African American, so they get very fired up about that distinction. So I actually work backwards from that. So we talk about why do you care about Black Lives Matter? Like why do you get upset when people say all lives matter? Great, okay. That's what preferential option for the poor is. It says like there's this need, and it doesn't mean we don't care about other people, but like this need is really immediate.
Good, and I think that's something that can translate into classrooms that may be predominantly white, right? Because I hear that a lot from my white college students. Well, don't all lives matter? Well, yes, of course they do, but something like Black Lives Matter is addressing a specific need. Okay, so all of this leads me, and I know we're pressed for time, so I'm sorry about that, but with this conversation of solidarity, I wanted to bring up this map. Anyone use the racial dot map? A couple of you. I think it's very similar to the, what was it called? Opportunity Atlas, except it's focused specifically on race. And if I can get the cursor to work, I will try to zoom in on Cleveland. I can't promise you anything here. Okay, let's add map, labels, There we go. All right, can we zoom in here? So this also takes census data. You see the key on the right there about population demographics by race. So you can zone in. I would imagine most of your students will see their homes here. This isn't the clearest picture. It will look much clearer on your own computer screens. But what we see here, because again, it's not very clear, but blue is white, green is black. So we have a kind of a band here in kind of eastern Cleveland, parts of Beechwood, that's predominantly African American. White's kind of in the suburbs here and west, and then a little bit of a more interesting mix there on the west side of Cleveland, which is its own issue in and of itself. But, helping our students see how their own city is divided, right? Something they may not be aware of with housing segregation, gentrification, those kinds of things. And this could tie into solidarity. This ties into communities, right? So, how can we live in solidarity with other people if we don't actually live with people who are different from us, okay? So how do we kind of cross those boundaries? All right, we have 5 minutes left. Any pressing questions, anything else any of you would like to share from your very good pedagogical practices? Yeah.
I'm just curious, what did you have on subsidiarity?
Solidarity?
Subsidiarity.
I don't think I had subsidiarity. I did not, but do you want to say more about it? Or your...
I was just curious.
Yeah. I think this is a good, so this idea of subsidiarity, right, in the Catholic Church is all about subsidiarity, right? If we could do things on the local level first, then we should do things on the local level first. And so I think that's a good conversation to have with your students as well, particularly around things like education. Well, who decides who's educated, what's educated? Is this in response?
No, I was just going to ask if you would mind showing or talking a little about the resources you had for dignity of work, rights work.
Yes, absolutely. But anyone else want to add anything? Because I don't feel like I gave you a good answer. But anyone want to add anything on subsidiarity or resources or practices they might have used to talk about that?
It's a term that certain elements of the Catholic Church right now love. And it's really popular in certain sides of political discussions. And so saying more about subsidiarity so that it's clarified and it's not owned by one camp.
Yeah.
It's my opinion of subsidiarity.
Yeah, I think also you could try to add, like, it's addressed in a lot of the different themes.
Mm-hmm.
I've seen 2 lists of themes. So one of the lists, the longer list, sometimes it does it as its own theme, but so dignity of work is kind of subsidiary because if people are getting a decent wage, then they're better able to. So kind of connecting it a lot with some of the different themes could be helpful, I think.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point too. All of these themes overlap, right, in very many ways, right? So you can all have kind of interconnections here as well. You asked for rights of workers, right? That's what, yeah, okay. I like this one too, right? The poverty spent thing helps with kind of seeing what people are actually paid. But, I'm curious as to whether our students still have this concept of the American dream. I don't know if that still is alive or it's kind of dead in our society, I'm not sure. But this question of can everyone actually pull themselves up by their bootstraps? Well, no, of course not, right? Lots of things play into this. So ask them, right? Another thing I would encourage you to ask your students, particularly those who are older, who are about to go to college or into the workforce, what do you want to be when you grow up? See what they say, then say why, and then say, no, really, why do you want to do this, right? Is it because you want to make a lot of money? Not that that's bad, right? But really pushing this idea of work as a vocation, right? Something in which you can be co-creators with God. So just to close off, the sources here, there's a case study there, executive pay, reward, or excess. A document from the bishops, A Catholic Framework for Economic Life. They, of course, have the longer encyclical, Economic Justice for All. That gets a little wordy, I think, but parts of it might be useful. For more visual, kind of hands-on, there's a documentary called Food Chains on the Immokalee workers, the tomato pickers and growers in Florida who have been fighting for fair wages for about a decade now. It's a little bit longer. It's about maybe close to 2-hour video. So if you wanted to show it, you'd have to spread it out. It is free on Amazon Prime, though, by the way, if you have that. And then another TED Talk, How to Combat Modern Slavery. He talks about kind of sweatshops and factory labor and kind of work in more of a global perspective. Any final questions or thoughts? Yeah.
Are we going to get this PowerPoint?
Ed has told me that yes, we can share this with you. So yes.
I couldn't write that fast.
I know.
I know, it's a lot.
So, Krista, let me flow one more in. Catholic social analysis sometimes gets a bad rap, and it's been sort of referenced that sometimes this is where we miss the boat as Christians. The course itself is an elective under Bishop Fordham as well. So what? Like, why should we take time out of our curriculum to start with Christ?
Well, I mean, so how many of your schools do service learning? Yeah, okay. So what? Why would you do that, right? I'm not trying to be flippant, right? But I think this course can be connected very nicely to those kinds of questions as well. If you're already out doing this work in the community, well, why are we doing it, right? If we're a Catholic school, part of our mission is being disciples and servants of others. So what does that mean? And so my two kind of pronged response to that is, well, if your school is already doing or focusing on community service in some way, this is a natural kind of foundation for that work. The other response would be, if you are a school with a Catholic identity, this is a key part of that Catholic identity. And, you know, in my opinion, I mean, obviously I do social ethics work. I think it opens a lot more questions that students aren't getting in other theology classes, right? About kind of real world events. Last question.
More of a comment.
Sure.
So with Catholic social teaching being so important, that critical conversation among departments of if this is an elective that's not being covered at your school, or if it's an elective that falls in that junior or senior year, what are those seeds that are planted in Scripture, in Christology, in Paschal Mystery, in church, that lead up to it to make sure, because there's Scripture basis, there's
absolutely
a community basis, that those themes should be tied in and seeds should be planted earlier.
Yeah, right. So I think in the ideal, these earlier classes are kind of pointing students in this, hopefully pointing students in this direction. Right. Yes, sir.
This is just a thought to maybe throw out even Dr. Hammer, if this would be a reasonable thing to consider. But I find really just the different resources really useful. And I wonder if we could maybe at some point set up some form of a Google Doc, maybe not even just for this course, but I'd love it for this course especially, where different people could put, 2 or 3 resources that maybe they use that they're particularly proud of and like how they work, I think it'd be cool just to see.
Yeah, and I mean, I'll defer to our leader here with that. But I will say I was going to include with the PowerPoint a list of sources, both what was on here and the other stuff that didn't make it in as well. But yeah.
I would be thrilled to help set up a facility some kind of online.
All right. Thank you all very much. I think it's lunchtime. Please enjoy.